turn over the class to Milt.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Welcome. I enjoy watching comrades work while I talk. I don't have to tell the comrades that we're living in very turbulent times. The crisis of the war at home, the splits in the ruling class, has, among other things, has deeply affected the labor movement, its leaders, and the rank and file. That includes the unorganized, the immigrants' struggle, LGBT, women's, could go on and on about the ferment that's going on, that's impacting now within the labor movement, the organized labor movement, and encourage comrades to get a copy or get it off the computers, a Business Week article, which I'm not going to go into this in my talk, but will indicate the tensions that have broken out within the AFL-CIO leadership. I would like to start out my remarks by pointing out, because it probably isn't well known, that Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky were not just theoreticians. They wrote extensively clarity in the struggle from 1848, the Communist Manifesto, Capital that Marx wrote, Engels, anti-Düring. I don't want to go through all the literature. But what's kind of in the background is that these leaders were not only theoreticians, they were organizers. They were brilliant strategists and tacticians. And the historic record shows that. As far back as 1864, Marx conceived of the First International, which was basically a workers' movement that struggled to come alive with all kinds of crises, and unfortunately or fortunately, finally ended up in the United States. But during that date, it was an interesting, not coincidence, but conjuncture, that the fight for the 10-hour day was won. And Marx took note of this based upon his efforts within the International Working Men's, and that's what they called it. Not, if it's today, it would be more than just International Working Men's Association. But I'd like to just quote two short remarks that Marx made as far back as 1864 about the winning the 10-hour day. He said, "It's only the working class that can liberate itself," as he heralded the 10-hour day for the workers. And then he went on to say that though he saw it as a process, not only a bourgeois concession, that's very important, but it would give strength and confidence to the workers to take the next series of class battles with the ultimate goal of a revolutionary process that he raised toward a socialist future. And he said, "Only a struggle with the state," and he means the bourgeois state, "and its machinery can the working class conquer political power." He understood the role of a repressive state, the capitalist state, and how winning concessions could be part of the process. And I emphasize this because I'll have to come back to it later on during the period when Lenin wrote his left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Now, as a result of this sequence of Marx and Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, our party was born in 1959. But we also went through a series of struggles to illuminate and elevate this tradition as a revolutionary Marxist current. And for 10 years we fought it out in the SWP, which I'm sure, the Socialist Workers' Party, which I'm sure comrades had classes on. But I want to dwell on one aspect of this struggle, and that was the trade union struggle that we faced inside the Socialist Workers' Party, which was a struggle during a very difficult period. The McCarthy period was unfolding, the Cold War, the beginning of the Korean War, and the end of the Second World War, which ended in '45, still had ramifications. Truman passed the Taft-Hartley in 1947, which to this day restricts and restrains and even is a union-busting amendment to the law. I'm sorry? So, what was our differences? The majority of the SWP felt there was a period in the labor movement of what they called quiescence. Everything is quiet. Don't do anything. There's nothing you could do. The red baiting, the workers are not moving. They're subject to the wars, the Korean War. And we didn't feel that way in Buffalo. And we had fractions in the steel plants. We had it in the in the auto plants. We had it in the electric plants in the Westinghouse with one of our founders, Dottie Bowen, was able to raise the women's issue to a level that got equality on the job bidding, a tremendous victory. So we worked as communists in these plants, even under difficult circumstances. We were red baited. Our names were in the paper. When the death sentence came down on the Rosenbergs, they wrote us up because of what we were doing. Our approach was, as different from the SWP, was to try to get a block with the Communist Party in those days, because the Communist Party was under the gun. And they were being victimized even more than the fact that we were being red baited and isolated and couldn't get work, couldn't get jobs. I couldn't run for office in Bethlehem Steel. We were fingered by the labor bureaucracy that were the police agents and the labor lieutenants. Vince Copeland, our founding member, had been fired in a struggle that was anti-Trotskyist, that most workers never heard the word Trotsky and saw Vinnie Copeland as a good, solid American worker. Thousands turned out to defend him. So there was, the point I want to make and then leave is there was lots of ferment. There was wildcats that we were participants in. We worked with the workers as they were, trying to educate them, trying to raise the level of consciousness, trying to move them in a direction of building and strengthening their trade union work. And we had some successes. So I'm raising this because I feel this was in the tradition of what I said earlier, under Sam Marcy's leadership, the tradition that I said earlier of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. We kept it alive. We had a revolutionary Marxist position and in spite of the pressure of a war and red baiting and all the other factors. Now, as a result of that, I'd like to go into the area, because I did discuss in my, and you haven't read my first article I wrote in 1993, how Engels intervened in a struggle in the United States, which was very significant, a struggle between the AFL, which was a crafts-oriented, conservative, case-hardened, bureaucracy, collaborative, you can name all the most reactionary terminology to him. And yet he called on Engels to resolve a struggle, and I'm not going to go into it because it's in my article. He called on Engels to solve a crisis that he had with the Socialist Labor Party as head of the AFL, and the Socialist Labor Party in those days was a very powerful movement, not as we'll go into later as it is today. It was powerful because they recruited thousands of immigrants who came from Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, and Germany, France, and Ireland, due to the poverty. And the SLP, the Socialist Workers' Party, wanted to enter in as an organization into the AFL, which was a workers' organization, not a political organization. And Engels sided with a conservative, reactionary labor leader named Gompers, Samuel Gompers. It was a principle about how a party relates to workers who are recruited from their jobs into a labor movement, notwithstanding the fact that that labor leadership and the way that labor movement was a craft-type union, racist and narrow-based. But he realized that the Socialist Workers' Party, which was friendly to Engels, that broke off, unfortunately for the Socialist Labor Party, because the next year, a few years later, in 1890, the AFL led one of the biggest, broadest, multiple mass action for the 8-hour day, and the Socialist Labor Party was isolated because they boycotted it, and the communists that was influenced by Engels joined it, played a role in it, met workers, and it's, in a sense, shows how important the communist movement, the communists, the revolutionary Marxists like ourselves, are so critical in times of crisis to give assistance, guidance, and understanding to the complex events that unfold between the labor movement and a party, a socialist party at that. That's what the Socialist Labor Party was. Now, let me bring us up to Lenin's time, when Lenin wrote Infantile Disorder, that's left-wing socialism and infantile disorder. He wrote it for the European, and by the way, the revolution, the seizure of power had taken place 2 years earlier when Lenin wrote this pamphlet. So the prestige of the Soviet Union, notwithstanding that it was not an advanced industrial economy or state, nevertheless the prestige was very high. But there were big problems during the period that preceded that Lenin put aside the counter-revolution that was taking place by the white guards, or what they called them, and decided to write this pamphlet. And I consider this one of the most important pamphlets in regard to his presentation of the problems in the labor movement. Though he wrote it for the European, particularly the Germans and the French, nevertheless it resonated here in the United States. Now, what was going on in the United States at that time when Lenin wrote this pamphlet? And by the way, when he wrote the pamphlet, it happened that Trotsky happened to be in the United States. It was in a little earlier, 1917 and 1918. And Trotsky had meetings in New York where he called for massive opposition to the First World War because the U.S. was on the edge of entering into that First World War. He called for massive opposition through strikes. Here he is in exile, not in exile, but here he is in the United States as a guest, telling the U.S. workers to form strikes, to oppose conscription, and to wage class struggle wherever you can to stop the bourgeoisie from entering, the U.S. bourgeoisie from entering into that First World War. Now, some of the conditions are important to note when Lenin wrote this pamphlet here in the U.S. In the U.S., what was going on at the time was big struggles over the question of entering the war. We know it if we put it in the terms of what's going on today. There was strong support for the war coming from the socialist movement, the Socialist Party, and other groupings from the AFL that was led by Gompers, that was gung-ho for the war, for U.S. entry into the war. And so the issue of the war became a big factor in this country, the First World War. The second big issue that confronted the U.S. workers was the issue, the defense of the Soviet Union that had just made its revolution. And that antagonized the right wing of the Socialist Party. It antagonized the AFL. It led to a lot of red baiting. But it was a major issue that unfolded here in this country. And before the Soviet Union was overturned, it was on the agenda from that day till 1991. The Soviet Union was always on the agenda. Now, other things were breaking out in the U.S. at the same time. There was different currents that were building up their support within the U.S. labor movement. There was the industrial workers of the world. They had a tremendous following in this country. You wouldn't know that today, and you wouldn't know about SLP, Socialist Labor Party. Why? Because no matter how courageous you are, no matter how bold in your tactics, your strategy, in winning concessions for the workers, if you have the wrong program, it could ultimately lead to your downfall. Now, the IWW, which, by the way, recruited some of the most famous, heroic leaders, like Eugene V. Debs, like William, I'm sorry? Yeah, they used to call him Wild Bill Haywood. Even Daniel DeLeon, who became president of the Socialist Labor Party. Even William Forster, who led the 1917 big steel strikes in this country. as well as the founding member of the Socialist Workers' Party that we were a part of, named James Cannon. They all came out of this IWW, led tremendous strikes, particularly in the West. They had a grouping out in the West that Bill Haywood led called the Western Federation of Miners. They led miners' strikes in the most bitter, brutal Montana and Utah, and they're all historic strikes. Coeur d'Alene and Butte, Montana. And they were all part of this wonderful revolutionary movement. But what was this movement trying to accomplish? Because they had so much hate, and rightly so, for the AFL and Samuel Gompers because of his conservative position, that they decided that they needed a dual union, that they needed unions that had nothing to do with the AFL, that by that time had a few million workers, particularly following the struggle around the 8-hour day. They had won a great deal of workers. So that they wanted an independent union, a dual union, a pure union, a red union, a communist union. And this came back to Lenin. And he wrote this pamphlet. I'll give more reasons for it, but I'll stay. Should revolutionaries work in reactionary trade unions? And when you read this pamphlet carefully, and I'll go over it, some of the important points, with a resounding yes, you cannot take a union as it is, as you wish it to be, but as it is, with backward workers, workers that are conservative, workers that are completely in tune with the program of the government, supporting the war, critical of the Soviet Union. So it became a very important point when he wrote this, when Lenin wrote this pamphlet. Now, I want to go over some points because it's unfortunate the class was called late. So I thought I'd put together some points that Lenin raised, and I'll give a brief analysis, and then we'll have discussions subsequent to the period following my talk. Lenin said, the party relies directly on the trade unions. Now he's talking as someone who just went through the rich experiences of making a revolution. See, he had just made the revolution, and he was telling the movements around the world some of the lessons that were learned from the success of a revolution. It's hard to conceive now, but when you seize power successfully, it just resonated all over the world. So Lenin put this thesis through this pamphlet to these movements around the globe. And one of the most important points was how Lenin thought of trade unions as they are with all the problems of a reactionary leadership. He saw the trade unions from the point of view of a relationship to a revolutionary party that could only bring success if that relationship was solidified, even though the minority in the trade unions were not socialist, obviously, but that building a minority of communists and revolutionaries within the trade unions was indispensable to making a revolution. And then he explains that the workers who are organized, they have the potential of, through the organized trade unions, to even become part of a military that would fight for the dictatorship of the proletariat if the block between the communists and the trade unions was solid, even if we were a minority in the trade unions. And then, so that he, putting it in terms of today, one of the big potent possibilities, and we did it in the 50s when we were in Buffalo and Youngstown and other cities where we had the workers, is to build fractions and prepare within the trade unions a communist fraction, a communist who then could organize, relate, understand the problems of their union, understand the problems of their workers. And from that process and development, a revolution, and I should say a major component of a successful revolution, can be achieved. Of course, Lenin included that there needs to be Soviets because so many are not part of the working class. They're unorganized. They're in other movements. They're in cooperatives. So that the Soviets were the key to organizing under the dictatorship of the party. See, society, socialist society. But that the trade unions was also a major, major component to organize the workers, even to bring them closer in, even though, as I said, they constituted a minimum numbers. Now, he also indicated that through those fractions, you have to work ceaselessly, agitate, propagandize, have newsletters, always constantly reaching out to the workers to raise their consciousness, whatever the situation was. Another thing that Lenin raised that's so important for us to know is that when capitalism, and speaking as a successful architect of a revolution, inevitably will lead to socialism. But the legacy of what capitalism has done to the workers doesn't change. It takes years and years to change the ruling class ideology, the deception, the control over all the medias and the state, of course, and its repressive organs. So he said, that's the way it is. They're backward. This is the legacy. Another reason for why communists should go in and not start some pure union and give up the training, the education to leaders like Gompers and others who he mentions in the European labor bureaucracy, the labor aristocracy, that they are only too glad that you left it up and withdrew. Go and build your red unions. We got the workers. That's important. So he said, you can't build socialism with abstract human material. You have to do it with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. But he said, too, to counter that the trade unions are the schools. They're the schools that teach, if we're mobilized in these unions, to teach communism in a process. Now, he wrote a pamphlet, a book, I should say, on strikes in 1899, Lenin did, right before the 1905 revolution. It was called On Strikes. And he said, a strike is not a revolution. It's the school that teaches class struggle, class consciousness, and that it's the process of reaching a revolutionary consciousness, so that when you're on strike, you know your enemy, you know your friend, you know your boss, you know your ally, you know the state, its repressive organs. You learn in the course of a strike, you learn what no book will ever teach you, but based upon your experience, you see the class struggle in life. And Lenin wrote extensively, but of course, Lenin, being the brilliant strategist that he was, he said, there are times you have to prepare for strikes. You just don't go out on strike unless the proper preparations are made so that you don't become victimized, you don't become depressed, or you don't become defeatist. And of course, he also indicated that there are all kinds of mass struggles if you're not in the unions, because in that period, the trade unions opened up even though the Tsar was still in power. There was a big upsurge of workers into organizing and fighting for unions. Now, he also made an important point, which I'll touch on. He said, reaction in the labor movement or in the trade unions, even among socialists, they don't like the word dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a term. They just don't like it. They get conjured up because, particularly in a system like capitalist democracy, workers think you vote, you get rights, you win things, that it's democracy. And a dictatorship, well, I'm not for that. And Lenin took that into consideration. As a matter of fact, Eugene V. Debs, who I would say is one of the most pioneer, finest labor leaders in the history of the movement, of the labor movement, from the point of view of the sacrifices he made, his principal positions on the war. He went to jail from a speech he made in Canton, Ohio, 1917, that there's only one war, and that's the class war between labor and management. And they sent him away for 10 years. Now, even Eugene Debs sent a letter to Lenin. I'm opposed to your dictatorship of the proletariat. It just don't resonate right with me. He even indicated that he didn't like Lenin killing off some social revolutionaries who were counter-revolutionaries at the time when power was still at stake. So you can see how difficult it is to understand what the dictatorship of the proletariat is in order to make a revolution, and how difficult it is to explain it even to the best. Other leaders in the IWW felt the same way. So he took that up as a factor in these building fractions, communist fractions in the movement, and also taken into account what some of these great leaders, who also were influenced by anarchism, which I'll go into in a short while. He also, and I think I mentioned this, how important it was, and he wrote it in this pamphlet, how important it is to gauge the conditions under that moment when you want to take an initiative in the class struggle. Have to understand, and how important this is from the point of view of Marxism, how important it is for communists and socialists to become the students of revolutionary Marxism, because only through that's revolutionary Marxism do you have the tools and the instruments for understanding the relationship of class forces in capitalist society, and unravel them and explain them with clarity and objectivity for the purposes not of an academic discussion, but of taking the initiative in a struggle. And he pointed that out as a very important point in his pamphlet. He also wanted to make sure that the anarchists like Debs, Debs joined the Socialist Party later on and ran for office from jail. And by the way, just anecdotally, he never forgave the Communist Party, which are very new. I don't know if it was formed at that time. 1919 is when the Communist Party, under the name the Workers' Party, was formed. But they were underground, and Debs was running for office from prison, and he wanted their support. And unfortunately, and this turned Debs for a while against the communist movement, its early movement, because they boycotted the election. From underground, they decided they couldn't support anybody. And Debs felt that the communists let me down. So important that we run our own candidates. This is an indication of how important it is that under the most difficult circumstances, how important it is to run our own candidates with a revolutionary Marxist development and a socialist perspective, and understanding the class struggle as it is and how we gravitate to the more oppressed on so many issues, as well as the workers who have now moved into the lower paying jobs, service-oriented women, and multinational. But also in this pamphlet, Lenin took after Gompers. He didn't want to give the impression that somehow by being critical of those who didn't want to go into the AFL because it was so reactionary. So he wrote a whole section that attacks Gompers in the most, the language I didn't write, but it's being called craft union, narrow-minded, selfish, case-hardened, covetous, petty bourgeois, labor aristocracy, imperialist-minded, imperialist corrupt. He went on and on to let the comrades know where he stood on the question of the AFL leadership under Gompers, who, by the way, never relinquished his leadership except for one election. Talk about democracy. Gompers was in power from at least 1886, and it could have been even before. That was when the AFL was founded. To 1924, and he had to die. He had to die. He died not at the, from the ruling class. He died because he was so old. Natural cause. Now, he was very careful about this point when he discussed this dual unionism that I talked about earlier. And he went into it on the basis of its relationship to syndicalism. Now, and therefore a term came up, anarcho-syndicalism. Now, we know today from the youth that was at the RNC how courageous they are. They're being defined as anarchists. We don't know if they're anarchists. We don't know if they've read Bukharin and and Proudhon and all of them. And I'm not encouraging you to read it, but there may be a time where we want to take it up because we have to know everything. But the feeling is that they're defined as anarchists. Well, in those days, the anarchists didn't take it only from Proudhon and the other theoreticians that were part of the French Revolution of 1871, that Marx honored for their courage and their ability to create the first embryo of a worker state. So he was very careful in handling the anarcho-syndicalists, except to show that the theory of one industrial union to solve all the economic and political problems brought by imperialism, its armed bodies of men, the state, its repressive organs, it was such a utopian conception that a trade union could solve all those political problems. So, in dealing with the anarchists, and there's an important, if comrades get something from that Sharon had, I was fortunate to get, which was the minutes of the Second Congress of the Communist International that had some leaders coming from all over the world after the Russian Revolution, that Zinoviev, one of Lenin's thinkers, discussed the anarchist movement in this very sensitive but yet thoughtful, yet polemical way. So I'm just giving you a sort of a sketch, thumbnail sketch of how important only this one section that's on reactionary revolutionaries working in a trade union. There's a whole more about parliamentarism and other aspects of the pamphlet which pretty much deal it in the same way, which I don't want to go into because I'd rather hope that we could have a discussion. So what Lenin did in that pamphlet was to strengthen, to sum it up in terms of the U.S. labor movement, what Lenin was able to do in the same way that Engels got involved in the struggle between the SLP and the AFL, Lenin was able to give guidance to the American movement, particularly the revolutionary socialist wing. Because what was happening at that time, there was so much turbulence, so much confusion, during the period, as I said, the war and these different ideologies that were emanating in the labor movement as it was in those days between 1914 and thereabouts, maybe and 1920, when Lenin wrote this, was regroupment, splits. There was all kinds of developments that could throw you. For example, inside the Socialist Party developed a left wing. The left wing of the Socialist Party was like a party within a party. It was like what we were in the SWP for 10 years. We were really a party within a party. We had entirely different ideological, but Sam Marcy and Vinnie and Dottie and others, we wrote on them. We didn't hide behind them. We went to conventions and spoke on them. Conferences, we spoke on them. We were a minority, but they were the majority, and we had to follow the discipline of the SWP. Well, that's what was happening in 1919, right before 1919. A left wing of socialists developed completely in contradiction to the Socialist Party that was the majority on the war, on the defense of the Soviet Union, on a host of questions as to even the issue of dual unionism and industrial. And I should make a point on it, the industrial development at the time, which I'll go into in a minute. The point I want to make is that the left wing of the Socialist Party recruited Eugene Debs. He left the IWW. He joined the left wing. And some of the other leaders, Vincent St. John and some of the others coming out of the Western Federation of Miners, became the left wing. And the moment came to split. And they split. And they became literally the Communist Party. But the Communist Party, as it split, was called the Workers' Party. And it had William Z. Forster, who was ultimately to be the head of the Communist Party, USA, and James Cannon, who was going to be the head of the Socialist Workers' Party that we joined later on. And the two of them merged. In the fights that took place, believe it or not, what most would think, how could this have happened? That the Communist Party that dates over the years, the Trotskyists, and the Trotskyists called the Communists Stalinists and Trotskyists. I mean, it's an inflamed situation. But the birth of the movement, they were together. And at that time, Trotsky was fighting as a left opposition inside the Soviet Union against Stalin, who had made a turn to the right after Lenin's death. And documents began to come out from the Soviet Union that finally, through Canada, I believe, came into Cannon's hands as well as Forster. Cannon became a Trotskyist, and Forster became a patriot of the Stalinist government. And so ultimately another split took place inside the Workers' Party. There were other differences about being underground because the repression in 1920, and you may have read the Palmer raids and other things, it was incredible. The imprisonment, the torture, the physical violence of the state was incredible. But there was a dispute over whether to come out of the underground and start functioning or whether to stay underground. There was arguments in those days legitimately over whether the craft unions should be replaced by industrial unions. And that was a very important question. And Forster had a good position on that when he tried to organize the steel workers and the packing house workers. What I mean by industrial working class as different from craft is that the industrial trade unions, and I'll give my own example of taking steel. When I worked in the steel plants, we had 32 classifications from a roller all the way to a laborer. And the wage scale were in the hundreds and hundreds of dollars per hour that a roller got, but a laborer didn't. In craft unions, that laborer wouldn't have been in the AFL. Neither would others who do the bull work. It would only be perhaps the rollers, the maintenance, the electricians. They would be very selective. So industrializing the trade unions was a very, very progressive development. And it did take form in this period under a bit of fight with the Gopper's forces. And in some cases, as in the 1917 steel strike, it failed because Woodrow Wilson and Gompers were hand in hand because of the war. So what I want to do is in giving you this picture, is to draw some modest preliminary conclusions. And that is this, that in every case where the communists ourselves are in the trade union movement or have some influence in the outcome of trade unions, it could be decisive, as small as we are. It could be, depending upon our understanding of revolutionary Marxism, our history that goes back to Marx, not only as a philosopher, not only as a theoretician, not only as having the ability to explain the very nature of capital, but he was an organizer, he was a tactician, so was Engels, so was Lenin, and if we have more time, we'd go into what Trotsky made a contribution during the course of his life based upon the experiences of the Russian Revolution. So that, as small as we are, with our history, understanding, skill, being creative but cunning as well, in regard to the class struggle, we can be a factor. Sometimes in winning concessions, where some, I've heard recently in a discussion, consider us a little kind of reformist because we're always fighting for concessions and we don't seem to be fighting for a revolutionary perspective, which is a repeat of an old argument that existed as far as Lenin struggling with the economists in the late 19th century, where the economists were the Social Democrats and the split took place between the Lenin forces and the Social Democrats over this very question of economists. Yes, we support concessions. Yes, we support any victory that the workers could make that denies capital its surplus value to whatever level. But we also pursue those concessions in a dynamic development with a revolutionary socialist perspective and view the tactics and the strategy that are necessary in the course of those struggles. So we are a factor, as small as we are. That's it.